In today's episode, I'm really excited to share my conversation with Wes Kao, an entrepreneur, advisor, executive coach, and more. Wes delivers fantastic advice to her newsletter readers every week. And in today's conversation with us, she shares a lot of great insights on management, managing up, and communication for engineering leaders in general. In my experience, these communication skills are some of the toughest ones to develop as a leader, especially since we might be dealing with difficult situations where our own emotions are elevated. So, for that reason, I encourage you to listen, especially to her perspective on how to focus on communication that leads to behavior change. So, that's enough for me. Let's get to my interview with Wes Kao.
Welcome to the Scaling Tech Podcast, where we help you manage your growing engineering team. Through expert interviews, we help you navigate the challenges of leading, hiring, growing, and nurturing your tech team to deliver the value your customers demand. Brought to you by agilityfeet.com, experts in staffing engineering teams in Latin America for clients globally.
Wes Kao is a very well-known entrepreneur, speaker, coach, and advisor. She's co-founder of Maven, an ed tech company that raised $25 million from First Round and Andreessen Horowitz. Previously, she co-founded the altMBA with bestselling author Seth Godin. You can sign up for her newsletter of over 40,000 high performers at newsletter.weskao.com. Welcome to the Scaling Tech Podcast, Wes.
Thanks, Aaron. Excited to be here.
It's a real pleasure to have you, real honor to have you on the Scaling Tech Podcast. So thank you so much for taking the time. I want to start with some of the advice I've seen you give before. It's one of my favorites. I'm on your newsletter, so see a good amount of this, and I really love the advice that you give to act like an owner. And I think it's a great bit of advice. I've given similar advice to managers who work for me, but then I feel like I've also seen it lead to situations where people maybe make decisions on their own, which they really should have gotten feedback on. So let's start with a tough question. How do you balance autonomy with communication and managing up?
I think most people assume that managing up and working autonomously are antithesis, that they are opposite. When really, the key is that one leads to the other. Managing up leads to autonomy. If your manager is not aware what you're doing, what you're thinking, the progress of various projects, they don't know if you are on the verge of this project collapsing and them having to clean up the mess, or if things are going on track. When you proactively keep your manager in the loop, they can trust that you have things handled. They can trust that you are thinking about all the right things. They can trust that you are looking around the corner on any issues that might pop up. And so by keeping your manager in the loop on a regular, consistent basis, that is how you earn the trust to work more autonomously.
I love that. That speaks to me a lot. I think that's really great. And I guess as myself, sometimes as the leader in the organization, though, when I think about giving people autonomy, I worry, am I being lazy as a leader? So, because really what I'm looking for is for someone to bring me solutions and suggestions, not just problems. I mean, it's obviously they need to bring problems at times, but I always prefer when someone brings some solutions or possible solutions, suggestions around that as well. And I think that's part of what you've talked about before in managing up when you say to reduce the cognitive load on your higher ups. So is that a good example of that, or is that an example where I'm being lazy as a leader and asking people to bring me a solution? How do you reduce cognitive load when you're managing up?
That's a great example. Basically, you don't want to accidentally put all the work on your manager's shoulders to figure things out. But that's exactly what we do when we go to our manager and we dump all our problems and our frustrations onto them and force them to do the heavy lifting by thinking about what to do, by thinking about solutions, by thinking about the upside and downside of various paths and the trade-offs of various paths and, the feasibility of various paths. That is the hard part. So you should embrace doing some of that hard part and then bring the idea to your manager so that you can both calibrate and figure out what is the best path going forward.
But going back to what you said about building trust creates autonomy. That's I like that a lot, and that's how, if you're bringing if you're bringing to your manager some different solutions and suggestions, then you are showing them that you've thought through the problem, not just bringing the problem there, right? And that creates that trust that allows the opportunity for more autonomy too. So I like that a lot, and I appreciate it. Is there a rule of thumb on bringing, like, always bring three ideas for the problem? Is there anything like along those lines that you would suggest, or is it enough to bring kind of one idea, or should you always have kind of choose between these two things but not 10 things?
Yeah, great question. I don't have a strict rule of thumb on this because I think every situation is different. And, you know, I think it's fine to bring a problem to your manager if you phrase it and frame it in a way that isn't forcing them to do all the hard work. Because a lot of people will say, well, Wes, does that mean I should stay silent on this problem because I don't have the solution yet? So do I, work on the back end to find a solution and then weeks later bring up the problem to my manager? If I do that, I've done that in the past and they wish that I would have brought up the problem sooner. Right. So that's another really common situation.
Yeah.
Um, and in general, I think most managers and leaders would rather hear about a problem sooner rather than later. They would rather be informed that this thing is going on, this challenge, this blip, this snafu, whatever it might be. And they don't want you to just try to keep it under wraps until you've thought of a solution. At the same time, there are better and worse ways to bring up a problem to your manager. So, regardless of whether you share one solution or two recommendations or three ideas, that is tactical and surface level. So, I think that matters less. I think what matters more is thinking about how do I structure what I'm about to say to my manager so that they can easily get a sense of the situation, the gravity of the situation, the magnitude, the frequency of this problem, really easily understand what's going on and where I'm looking for their help. If you frame your problems in that way, you automatically sound more competent, more grounded, more strategic. And it's the same problem. It's the same problem that you would have data dumped on and just verbal vomited to them, right? You're just adding a little bit of structure and a little bit of framing up front to make it easier for them to understand and digest what's going on and very quickly and easily figure out how they can best help you.
Yeah, I like that. Staying away from the verbal dumping, and you used the phrase earlier too of trade-offs. I think is really important. So, like, if you don't have a problem, you have a problem, but maybe you don't have the solution in mind, or you're struggling with what is a good solution to this, because it's then bringing that up and having that discussion openly with your manager too seems like a good idea to me.
Yeah,
Uh,
because
I-
sometimes you might not even know if something is a problem worth bringing up, right? If this is a newer area for you, or uh, you're new to working with this manager, you're still calibrating on the types of problems,
right.
the types of issues that they want you to flag versus to take care of on your own. So I think over time, when people have worked together for many years, they usually can quote unquote read each other's minds a little bit, right? Because you have so many data points of what it's like working with that person, what they need, what they don't need, that gradually you calibrate with each other. But in the short run, when you are, newer to working together or you're working on a newer project, flagging an issue and bringing it up to your manager and saying something like, hey, I'm noticing this happening with our customers. I'm not sure if this is worth mentioning or if we want to take action. I personally think it's something we should monitor because the impact of it isn't too bad. It's only about impacting a handful of customers right now. But I wanted to flag it to you and let you know that it's happening.
Yeah.
Right? Like something like that is an FYI where you're letting them know what you're noticing. You're sharing primary data because your manager might be hearing from their 5 other direct reports. They might be in a leadership meeting. They might be in a cross-functional team meeting that you're not in, where actually there are other data points popping up about this issue. So when you share this information with them in a way that is flagging it with the appropriate level of severity, right? It's not like, oh my God, all hands on deck, this is terrible. No, right? Like you're bringing your point of view to it. You're saying, I think this is an okay issue for now. I don't think it's a huge deal. You're still giving them this information that allows them to make more informed decisions about your particular project, but also to connect dots across and more laterally with other areas that they might be working on that you have, less visibility into.
Oh, that's great. And I like how you talk about, especially if you're new to the role, you may not know if it's a problem or not. And as you were also kind of saying there too, you may not also know the impact of it. You may not be certain how bad is this impact or what the trade-offs are. And so managing up and reporting up to that, I think is, an incredibly important skill. It's a combination of being confident, I guess, that you understand the issues and that you have something, positive to say and to bring up, but also the right amount of humility that, you have some ideas how to solve it, maybe not a complete solution yet, but you're willing to put yourself out there and say this might be a problem, and that all of that, showing that right combination of confidence and humility is a great way to build trust with someone in any conversation, right? So incredibly important in a professional context too. Now, I want to talk a little bit about kind of your background, because you have an incredible background as an entrepreneur and extra gift of being able to clearly communicate leadership lessons to others as well. I'm curious, in your background, was there some lesson or experience in your career that kind of set you on this path? What inspired you through your work with at Maven as well as an individual coach to share those lessons with others?
I started writing online in 2010. So it's been a while now. And the practice of sharing my insights publicly and writing to my former self has been just a huge, just tremendous practice that I think has sharpened me in every way. In the beginning, when I first started writing, I would dissect ad campaigns. So marketing campaigns, ad campaigns that I saw that I thought didn't really land. And I would dissect why and kind of explain. And for me, that was, I think, looking back, my way of nerding out and trying to connect with other people who would nerd out about the same things. Sometimes our coworkers or our workplaces, you don't have someone where you can nerd out together about this thing that you're, more obsessed than average about, that, you think more about than a reasonable person would. And I think the great thing about the internet is that you can find so many communities and so many people out there who nerd out about the same things. And so that's kind of what got me to start writing online. And then more recently, in terms of sharing leadership lessons, sharing lessons from company building, my own management experience, etc., I realized when I was building Maven that I was coaching my direct reports and spending a lot of time giving specific great feedback. And I would look at it and think, wow, like it's a little bit of a shame that only one person is going to read this, you know? So I would think that, and then I would share it more broadly within Maven in our Slack. And that kind of helped increase the impact of folks who were able to benefit from, a pretty universal lesson. And I basically saved a bunch of clippings and notes of things that my team found helpful. Docs that I rewrote before and after examples of something, and I saved these little files for a future date when I have more time to be able to write about them. And so now I am an advisor, I'm a coach, and I have the space to be able to share these insights more widely in these long form, deep newsletters. And the thing that I really think about is a framework I call TACS, TACS. Tactical, actionable, concrete, and specific. So I think that those are the elements of great content, but also of great feedback. You want feedback to be tactical, actionable, concrete, and specific. And so with every newsletter I write, I make sure to think about that and really go beyond the surface of stuff that generally smart people already know, basically. I feel like there's a lot of advice out there that generally smart people already know. How do you go deeper? To unpack, trickier situations, share real examples, share the root cause of something, like recently I've been thinking about being concise and how everyone I know is trying to be more concise. I've written about it a couple times in various ways, and it's just something that everyone is working on. And these are all relatively smart people. And so if we're all working on this, like, why is it so hard for us to be concise? And as I thought about it, I came upon an insight, which I think is the reason why it's so hard and what's preventing us from being concise is that it's really hard in real time to both think of what you want to say and then edit yourself to um, assess what is the real nugget and root of what you want to say. Doing those multiple steps those are different cognitive steps. And when you're trying to be concise, explaining something new, for example, like it's hard to do all those things, right? If you think about the flip side, there are certain stories that you've told a dozen times, many dozens of times, and you know exactly when people are going to gasp. You know exactly when they're gonna pause, they're gonna hold their breath, they're gonna lean in because you've told that story a bunch of times, right? And so you can be concise there because you have multiple reps in which you've tested that material. In normal conversation, we are normally not, explaining something more than once or twice necessarily, and so it's much harder to do those multiple steps at one time. And so my solution from kind of digging deeper into the root cause of, how do you really be concise, which I'm still fleshing out in an essay, my proposed solution is that you have to do a little bit of preparation. That even 30 seconds of preparation or even 5 minutes before a meeting, for example, knowing, if you can anticipate a question you're going to get asked, to think about for even a few minutes, what is the most important thing that I want to share here? And then how can I say that first? And then give the option to elaborate.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I also, having told a lot of the same stories over and over in my life, I also know when people start to nod off in them, which is a little
Yes.
reminder to myself of, okay, I need to tell this story in a more concise way the next time. But I mean, let's relate this to more difficult conversations in the workplace, because I think that's perhaps where it's extra important to apply your tax framework. So, um, in your experience, what's the most important advice from that you would give, say, an engineering manager specifically, of how to communicate in a difficult situation?
It depends on what the difficult situation is, and your dynamic with that person. So I think that's kind of the first big variable. Um, I think in general, thinking ahead to what you want to get out of the conversation. Where are you hoping you will land as the outcome? If you spend even a couple moments grounding yourself on that, it will allow you to lead and guide the conversation in a much more strategic way, in a much more productive and effective way. I think where people go wrong is you go into a tricky situation and you might have been feeling frustrated for a while before bringing it up with this person, and it's already a fraught topic, um, and all it takes is a smirk from the other person, them raising an eyebrow, right? Um,
Right.
and that's it. That's all it takes for you to snap and just like lay it on them, right? Like you just like really just lay it on them, and that's just it's really unproductive. So I have a framework that I call strategy versus self-expression. Self-expression is trying to teach people a lesson, trying to have the last word, trying to get them to acknowledge how you feel and how, this has been very difficult for you. Um, and excuse me. So self-expression is usually 90% of what you initially want to say. Strategy is the 10% of all of that that will lead the person to change their behavior in the way that you want them to change their behavior. So you really want to take a step back and think, how can I be strategic here? Given that this topic is already, something that we're both coming in with, that in a little bit of a frenetic energy, and think about strategy versus self-expression.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent phrase to remember. It's one I'm going to try and remember more as well, because especially when it is a frustrating conversation, whether I'm the person managing up or I'm the leader in that organization. I've been in both times where I have realized that I'm venting a little bit here, right? And so I've in in a recent tense conversation that I had, for instance, I was reminding myself, I made kind of like the advice you were giving. I had a short, just, post-it notes, not too much space, just 3 bullet points of what I wanted to make sure I talked about in this meeting. And then in big letters next to it, I wrote positive, be positive, just as
Mm.
a little reminder to myself when I was looking at it, because it was a situation I was frustrated about. And I knew I would have the tendency to want to vent some of that frustration, but it wasn't productive at that point. And so, reminding myself that these are the things we want to talk about. This is kind of the strategy. This is what I want to get out there. And in order to get the change that I want, to get the effect that I want in this conversation, I need to make sure that I'm, being positive in the presentation of that too. So I like that a lot. And yeah, I remember you talking about a strategy versus self-expression in one of your articles, and saying that that's the most common reason that a conversation fails, when someone just
Mhm.
goes straight into self-expression mode.
Mhm.
So I think that's really important.
I think the second most common reason that conversations fail is when people are too me focused. So it's related to the strategy self-expression. But this one is where you're framing everything about how it impacts you. And it's not necessarily for negative stuff. It can also be about something you're excited about. You talk about why this is exciting for you, for your team, for your work, for your career, and no one cares. So that's like, the gist of it is people are thinking about themselves. They want to know why this is good for them, why this is good for their career, why this is good for their growth, why this is good for their department or their team or reaching their goals. So,
Yeah.
that's something that I constantly remind myself of, whether I'm writing an email to someone, giving feedback to a team member, sending a cold DM, really thinking about how does this benefit the other person? Because they don't need to know why this is exciting for me. The fact that I am reaching out to them and asking them to do something, subconsciously, we already know that it benefits me somehow, right? Otherwise, I
Right.
wouldn't be asking you to do this thing. So really thinking about moving that lens away from me centric to you centric is very very useful. And I have an exercise that I do that I highly recommend. So pull up an email that you have, let's say, and highlight all the parts that are about yourself in one color. Let's say highlight all that in yellow, and then in green, highlight the parts that are about the other person. And when you look at whatever you just wrote, you might be shocked that the majority of the majority of the page is yellow highlights that are mainly about you. I see this all the time with cover letters or pitches, sales emails, customer retention emails. It's all about the company and how we want you to do this. This feeds into our vision of becoming this. Our mission is to this and this and this. And if you put on your customer hat, as a consumer yourself, like you're just eye rolling, like, okay, like yet another company that thinks of me as a pawn in their game to like help them become a unicorn. Like that's not appealing to me.
Right.
So you really want to think about how can I make this message more you focused?
I want to take a moment to tell you about our sponsor, WebRTC Ventures. At WebRTC Ventures, our teams are experts in building live video into your web or mobile applications. We've literally built hundreds of them. We have over a decade of experience using both open source and commercial media servers in a wide range of industries, including telehealth, edtech, broadcasting, and more. We also publish a lot of helpful tips and industry interviews on our website and our YouTube channel. So be sure to check out webrtc.ventures and we can help you build, scale, and deploy your video solution. Oh, that's great. And that leads me to a kind of a specific example that I know that engineering managers face a lot that I wanted to get your take on. The business team and engineering are, kind of negotiating what to work on next in building the application, let's say, right? The business team typically has a long list of features that they want developed, that they want built. The software engineering manager has a list of technical debt that they want to address, or maybe some interesting technical things that they want to work on. And there's this prioritization conflict between the two because there's limited time and resources to tackle both. And I think, um, it's an easy situation for the engineering manager to present things from the engineering manager's perspective. So how do you suggest that they would approach that conversation with the business leader of saying, we've got this pile of technical debt that, we care about, but you should too, or you should at least let us work on it. How do you handle that sort of conversation?
I have a framework that I find helpful here, which is I call it good things, bad things. So, what good things will happen if we do this? And what bad things will happen if we don't do this? I find that this is a really simple way to cover both the upside and downside. Usually, people are either more compelled or more convinced by, people are in two buckets. So, one is you're more convinced by upside gains, right? Newness, expansion gains, and then other people are more convinced by reducing downside risk and avoiding loss. Most people tend to be in the latter bucket of not wanting to lose something, not wanting something bad to happen. And the great thing about good things, bad things is that you cover both. So regardless of whether your audience is in one bucket or the other, you address both, and you're able to share both the trade offs and the stakes of either taking action or not taking action. So it's this really beautifully objective way where you lay out the objective facts of the situation. So, the business leader, technical debt, it feels so abstract. Like, okay, there's this like stuff that we want to clean up. Sure. Like who doesn't have that? Like there's many business versions of that, it
Right.
feels so arm's length. It's hard to feel the concrete impact of if we do it or if we don't do it. But if the engineer were to say, if we don't clean this up in the next month, when we launch this new thing, the chances of that breaking are much higher,
Right.
right? Or if we don't clean this up, the data that we're capturing and using is very faulty. Like
Mhm.
you're going to be getting some data, but it's not going to be usable. And you're going to be trying to make decisions off of that.
Yeah.
So do you see how all of a sudden that problem feels much more real to me, as the person hearing that? And then you can share the good things too. So, the good things that will happen if we do this is your team will be able to XYZ, or we'll be able to serve our users in a much better way because we'll be able to better track their behavior and understand what they want from us. Right?
Mhm.
Like, so it might be whatever, depends on the future, but addressing the good things and the bad things, I find is a really simple way to kick off any conversation where you are wanting to propose an idea and very quickly help people get grounded on why should we do this? And if we don't do this, what are really the stakes?
Yeah, it comes back to that relationship between trust and autonomy that you spoke about at the beginning. I think, right? Because again, you again spoke of trade offs, right? And being transparent with those trade offs and talking between engineering and business about these are the trade offs, the pros and the cons about doing this. And not only is it, I think, lead to a more productive conversation than just saying, but you got to let me work on my stuff too. I want to play with cool tech, right? We have to relate that to the pros and the cons, be transparent about why we want to do this, talk about the benefits it leads to them. You mentioned several. Another common one would be to say, the engineering managers often say as well, if you let me address this technical debt, it should allow us to complete those features faster in the future. So we're going to, we
Hmm.
need to take a little bit of time to, address this foundational problem we've got going on, but then we're going to be able to work through things faster in the future. And being open about that, right? I think is really powerful, really important. Something I always think about too in that is, who gets to have the final say in that? And I guess my take, I'm curious if you agree, is that between the business and engineering in a conversation like that, ultimately the business, the product owner in an agile team, always has the final say on that and should. So the engineering team can say, hey, we'd like to address this technical debt. We'd like to make this upgrade to the code framework or whatever. But ultimately, if the product owner, if the business says, look, we've got a marketing deadline next week, we have to meet that first. Then we can come back to this. That you kind of have to, you have to let them address that, right? And say, because there may be reasons that they understand that, putting off a customer impact bug is actually okay because the potential growth impact of something new is larger, right? These are really difficult decisions to make, but we have to trust that the business, generally speaking, is going to have a larger view of the trade-offs between those impacts than engineering. But the more we can be transparent with them, the more at least we can engender that trust between the two parties to have an open conversation about it. I don't know. That's my take. But, do you think
Yeah.
someone always gets the final say?
I don't necessarily think so. I think it depends on who is closer to the problem and has visibility into things that maybe other parties don't have visibility into. So this is why I think it's less about who has the final say, in my opinion, and more about doing what's best for the business. and always advocating for what's best for the business. So in the example that you gave, which I love, if there is a marketing deadline next week for a launch, and prioritizing that will be better for the business than, and we can afford to wait, another 2 weeks to fix, this bug. We're doing what's best for the business. It's less, it's, I think that creates a posture that's less about functional, like, this is my perspective speaking as the functional expert here, or like, this is my perspective from this title or this team, and more about how can we do what's ultimately best for the business. Like, sometimes that might be, your idea, sometimes it's my idea, and it doesn't really matter whose idea it is as long as we're surfacing what is most likely to be most right. And I think that takes everyone chiming in. Um, and, I do think that there's almost a moral responsibility that each of us have, regardless of what team we're on, what function we're in, where if you're noticing something, if you're noticing a pattern, if you're noticing, a hunch, you want to share that out with everyone else. I think that you owe it to your team to speak up about it and to learn how to speak up in a way that people are likely to receive your message. There are better and worse ways of speaking up. And I think you owe it to yourself and everyone else to learn how to flag and bring up and have productive conversations. Because when all of us do that, we're more likely to work with a clearer picture of what's going on. I would never want an engineer that I work with to, feel like, well, Wes has the final say. So, I brought this up in a half-assed way, casually in conversation, and she, didn't really give it much attention and kind of moved on to something else. And so, therefore, my responsibility is done. Like,
Yeah.
that's not what I want them to think.
Right.
Um, and there's a great scene from a movie called The Last King of Scotland that I think is just such a fantastic analogy. And it's this dictator who has an advisor, African dictator with a British advisor, and something blows up, something goes wrong, and his advisor comes in the room one day, and he's like, "Oh my God, you did not tell me not to do this thing. Like this is all your fault. That like this whole thing blew up, and you should have advised me. This is why I hired you." And the advisor says, "I did mention it. I did tell you not to do it." And the dictator, who's played by Forrest Whitaker, says, "But you did not convince me."
That's
And I
great.
just love that. I just love that, right? Because, like,
Yeah.
who knows how you would have said it? Like, you should have tried harder to convince that person. So, like, all of us, we wear multiple hats. Sometimes we are the person receiving information and making the decision. Other times we are the ones trying to influence someone who is making the decision. And so when we're receiving information, I think we should try to, pick up on unsaid clues, read between the lines, listen well, etc. But when we're the one that's pitching someone, I like adopting the posture of I should do whatever it takes to help you see what I see. And if you
Yeah.
still come to a different conclusion, that is okay. But I'm it's my responsibility to convince you of this
Mhm.
matter and to like use all of my creativity and my internal fortitude to get you to see what I see.
So in that the scenario I proposed earlier of, an engineering and a business leader debating priorities between two things, and the engineering leader, says, we've got to do this technical debt because it's a security risk, let's say, right? There's an imperative need to the business here to address this potential security vulnerability. And for whatever reason, at the end of the conversation, the business leader kind of, wins that phase of the argument, let's say, and they agree, okay, we're gonna set it aside for a couple more weeks and come back to it. How do you continue to make that case for convincing? I mean, I think about following up with a written email of the decision afterwards. We talked, we agreed on these trade-offs, but like, how do you do that without kind of it just looking like well, I'm just trying to cover my ass, or I'm being maybe a bit of a jerk because I lost the argument if I'm the engineering leader in that situation. How do you keep pushing forward that conversation in a way that benefits the business?
I think word choice matters here. If you write an email in a very CYA way,
Right.
and it looks like you're trying to document, then people are going to receive it in a certain way.
Right.
But if you follow up and say, I understand why we need to prioritize this other thing.
Mhm.
Um, I still really strongly believe that it only takes one, you know, one user, their data getting leaked or whatever, for
Right.
all of this to come crashing down. Like, so this is a pretty high risk for us, and I want to set a date where we can reconvene, or I want to set a time frame and get aligned on what's a general time frame that you're thinking. Because for you as an engineer, that's useful information. If this person is thinking, let's say you ended the conversation saying, well, let's punt this to until after this launch, right?
Right.
After this launch could be the week after, or it could be a year after,
Right.
right? And so generally, like, it's useful for you to get a general sense of what timeline are you thinking here.
Mhm.
I propose that we do this in the 3 weeks after this launch, because, and then share your reasoning, because it's, in between that launch and another launch that's coming up, right? Or because, this will be a little bit of a lull period where, we would have just sprinted to launch this other thing. And so, we can catch up on some technical debt, right? So share your thought process. I think not enough people share their thought process. They just kind of
Yeah.
say the recommendation, and then don't really share the rationale and the logic behind that recommendation, and how compelling your assertion is, or your recommendation is. A lot of times depends on the logic. Like, that is the meat of your, where is this coming from, right? And so you want to proactively share what is your logic behind recommending something.
So share your thought process. I also heard you say like set a timeline there for revisiting the decision. And that helps to show that you still think this is valuable, that this needs to, we need to come back to that. And then I like also how you started with, writing that response in a phrase of like, I understand we made this decision, or your perspective was this, et cetera. Yeah, that kind of makes me think of the exercise you talked about of the, was it green highlighting when you're talking about
Mhm.
the other person's needs, and yellow when you're using I phrasing and talking only about your own positioning. So making sure that that follow-up email, it doesn't look so much like a CYA because you're phrasing it in terms of their needs, in terms of the business's needs, and setting appropriate, next steps around that. So I think that's great. I mean, it gets back to that thing about, I've heard you talk about aiming for one goal, behavior change, and everything else you might want to say, keeping it to yourself. And that's I think that's a hard thing to do, but really important in effective communication in difficult situations. So I want to come back a little bit to that concept too of self-expression, because I know it's in my role sometimes I found myself in difficult conversations saying something like, okay, but can you understand that from my perspective or from the customer's perspective, this thing that you did made me feel this way or made the customer feel that way. Would you say that that's like giving good feedback, or is that just kind of me self-expressing and venting a bit? I mean, how do you know the difference between these things?
I would say, for the example of you saying it, about how you feel, and
Hmm.
can you acknowledge how this is making me feel, I would put that in the self-expression bucket.
Hmm.
The other one with the customer of, you know, can you acknowledge or explain back to me, like, why the customer might have been irked by this? That I feel like is part of strategy, not self-expression. And the reason I say that is because you want the other person, let's say they did something that upset a customer, you want to make sure that they understand why you want them to change their behavior when interacting with customers. So, when you are too blunt in this way, um, you know, we need to have a little bit more finesse when we're addressing, high stakes customers like this. And they felt really turned off. And, then we need to spend the next few weeks winning them back over. So there's a cost to, when you react in that way. Right. And so,
Hmm.
like, can you acknowledge that? Like, can you, like, I would, in those situations, I sometimes like having the person explain what they heard back to me, and their own logic, instead of me lecturing them on, well, when you say this, customers do blah blah blah. When you give people a chance to reflect and say, can you see how that might have been off-putting? Like, when you wear your customer hat, and like this company that you're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to do the service for you, like, comes back and like is a little snippy with you, like, you would feel weird about that, right? Like you would not
Right.
be pleased, right? And so I would give them a chance to be like, okay, yeah, I can see how, blah, blah, and let them talk it out. Because that is, the reason that strategy is because it's helping them comprehend the situation. You
Mhm.
need comprehension, you need understanding because people can change their actions without understanding, but I think that it sticks less and doesn't resonate as much as when people really understand the root cause of something. They see the logic, they see the reasoning, and they're like, oh, okay, like I see why this matters. And when you understand the root cause, there's a bunch of tactical changes you might make or not make, things you might say or not say in the moment because you understand the deeper root of, this customer is paying us a lot of money and, technically they have leverage here because we agreed to do this. We just changed our minds afterwards and we're like trying to play it off or whatever. Like you kind of understand like what is my leverage here? What's the other person's leverage? How do I react appropriately? So that deeper understanding piece I think is very important.
Excellent. I appreciate it. Sadly, we're coming to the end of our time here. There's so much more that I want to ask you about, Wes. So I'm just going to ask you one final question. At what point do you decide that you're no longer managing up, or that managing up is not effective and it's just time to leave the organization? How do you know that difference when it's time, that managing up's not working for you? You feel like you're just babysitting sort of your boss, perhaps. You know, where do you draw that line?
This one is really tricky because our perception of a situation may or may not be accurate. There's a spectrum of how accurate our read is on something. And I think the best analogy for this is there's a subreddit called Am I the Asshole? AITA, where there, people on the internet submit situations. Most of them are, firmly think that the other person's the asshole and they want
Sure.
validation from everyone to say like, you're in the right. And so the four options are you're the asshole, the other person is the asshole, no one is the asshole, both of you are assholes, or like not enough info.
Right.
Um, and I'm just constantly surprised by how people will write in with so much conviction that in their mind, truly, they believe that they were doing the right thing, that, they had the moral high ground here, that their logic, makes more sense than the other person's logic. And then, like, they'll be called out by, the crowd, people on the internet saying like, "Oh, actually, like that, like you read the situation wrong," or like your reaction was actually not reasonable. The other person was actually being very reasonable. So the way that this relates to, your relationship with your manager is, for example, I've heard people say that their managers were micromanagers.
Mhm.
And then my follow-up question is, well, how much do you manage up? Like, do
Mhm.
you share what you're working on? Do you share your thought process? You know, and they'll be like, no, not really. And it's like, okay, well, your manager has to breathe down your neck to get any piece of information from you. So they're trying to draw information out. That's the
Yeah.
only way that they understand what's going on. So are they a micromanager or are you just shit at communicating? Like it could go either way depending on, your unique situation. So I think like first is being really intellectually honest with yourself. How might you be contributing to a situation? Because we can all be unreliable narrators in some ways. And I think intellectual honesty is the antidote to that. The second is benchmarking somehow. So do other people think this person is a micromanager? If you're the only one who thinks that they are, that's usually a sign that maybe the problem is you. Or describe the situation to a coach, a third party, to try to get their input. And then lastly, it also depends on how how you feel about the situation too. Like I will say that matters. If you are feeling tired, if you're feeling, fed up, or you don't feel like this is the place for you, you don't feel like you get along with your manager. In my experience, it is quite hard um, to change people more than a little bit. You just don't have the leverage to do that. Both it goes both ways. Like I think it's quite hard for managers to change their direct reports more than a little bit. And same for if you're a direct report trying to change your manager. And so I do think that there is fundamentally the thing of chemistry and like, are you simpatico or not? And if you feel like it is just constantly an uphill battle to do anything with your manager, then there might be a better fit for you somewhere else where you're not having to spend this much energy just trying to make things okay all the time.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Wes, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go subscribe to that Reddit after this and try and be intellectually honest
Good.
with myself. You've given me a lot of food for thought here. How can our listeners get in touch with you for more information and to sign up for your newsletter?
So my newsletter is weskao.com/newsletter. And I also post on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Thank you so much, Wes. Really appreciate you joining us on the Scaling Tech podcast.
Thank you.
On behalf of the thousands of developers we've placed with our clients, I want to briefly tell you about our sponsor, Agility Feed. Agility Feed has been building nearshore agile teams for U.S. companies since 2010. We were an early pioneer in doing this sort of developer staffing. Our team can help you recruit talented software engineers and technical teams in Latin America. We'll handle all aspects of recruiting, contracting, and payments for you so you can focus on delivering great software. To learn more, check us out at agilityfeed.com. That's agilityfeat.com.